Hi, my name is Megan Brothers. I am the Health and Human Sciences Educator for Purdue Extension in Vandenberg County. I want to welcome you to the YMCA Upgrade Teaching Kitchen. Today we're talking about food safety in your own homes. The holidays are around the corner, and we want to make sure that your food and the food that you're sharing with your family and friends is as safe as possible to protect you and them. So I'm going to give you some tips and ideas to keep your kitchen safe and clean so that you can keep your food safe to eat and to last as long as possible. So food safety starts at the grocery store. When we're doing our grocery shopping, and this might be whether you are doing your grocery shopping in person or even if you're doing store pickup, but we have to think about how the store is laid out, because food, once it leaves refrigeration or freezing, can start to have that clock ticking for foodborne illness and for bacteria growth. So we want to keep that in mind as we are doing our shopping. We recommend doing shopping by buying those things that are shelf stable, those dry goods, produce that doesn't need refrigeration first, and saving those refrigerated and frozen items toward the end. So it might take some planning to really think about and also reduce the amount of time you're in the store. And it also, if you're doing some planning, might reduce the amount that you spend because you may not be going down aisles that you don't need things in, and it might reduce some impulse buying as well. So when we're shopping in the grocery store, how we even have our cart is important. So some grocery stores even have bags that you can put your things like your meats in to keep them extra protected, because even if it's in a sealed plastic like this, it can still leak out. So we want to make sure that we are keeping it as far away from our fresh food as we possibly can to keep that cross-contamination, which is what happens when bacteria from a food gets onto a food that's ready to eat. And it won't be cooked, so that bacteria is just sitting there waiting for us to ingest it. So either using a bag or making sure that the food is separated as much as possible is really important when we're shopping in that grocery store. Thinking about food safety, whether or not that we need to put it in refrigeration, we think about what we call TCS foods, or time temperature control for safety. And those are foods that might be at higher risk for having bacteria in them, and that bacteria growth might happen when they aren't refrigerated, because bacteria, like I said, loves heat. So it'll grow most quickly when it's in warmer temperatures. So the time and temperature control for safety foods are our milk and dairy products, our eggs, and any kind of poultry, our meats, so our beef, our lamb, our turkey, fish, shellfish, crustaceans, baked potatoes, so potatoes that are raw don't need refrigeration, but a baked potato does need to be refrigerated as a leftover. Anything that's been heat-treated plants, so that would be our cooked rice, cooked beans, cooked vegetables. Once you cooked them and put heat on them, then they become time temperature control for safety foods, so they need to go back into a refrigerator as a leftover. Tofu or soy proteins, sprouts, sprout seeds, cut produce. So a lot of whole produce does not need to be refrigerated, but once it's been cut and had more surface area exposed to potential bacteria, then they need to go into refrigeration to keep them safe. Even untreated garlic and oil mixtures, those need to be time and temperature controlled for safety. So that gives you a little bit of an idea on that. So when we're looking at foods that don't need to be refrigerated, so those can include things like our tomatoes. Yes, tomatoes do not need to be refrigerated, and sometimes they actually retain the flavor better when they're not under refrigeration. So tomatoes, our onions, potatoes, those can be stored in an oven. Many apples, if it's going to be less than a week, can be stored out. Our home preserved, if they have been preserved safely and properly, those foods can be out on a shelf. And of course, our dry goods, things like rice and beans and things like that, those can be stored out of time and temperature. So if we have ready to eat foods, those are foods that don't need a lot of prep to cook. They're not going to be cooked. They can just be eaten right away. That might include our leftovers as well. Those foods can go on the top. And when we think about the structure of our refrigerator, and all refrigerators are a little bit different, so yours might vary, but when we think about it, we have different shelves, and then usually there are drawers in our refrigerators for our produce and meats and things. So when we're thinking about it, what we're wanting to do is reduce the amount and chance of food being cross-contaminated. And again, that's when that bacteria gets on the food that's ready to eat. If I have raw meat over food that's ready to eat, and that raw meat starts dripping, that's going to drip onto my food and potentially cause it to be unsafe. So we want to keep those foods that are ready to eat at the top so that there's less risk of that from happening. Our condiments, our pickles, our preserved foods that may not be, that they may be a little bit more shelf stable, they may have some stuff in them to help them be at less risk for having that foodborne illness in them. So those kinds of things can go out of the raw ingredients, period, our meats, our dairy foods. Those kinds of foods really need to be stored in the coldest part of the refrigerator so that they stay cold and it reduces the amount of heat that bacteria loves to be able to grow. All right, let's talk about our produce and where produce needs to go. Because the type of produce that you have in your refrigerator is important. And those, if you have crisper drawers, some of them have. Let's talk cleaning, because cleaning is almost as important as how you are storing and keeping your food safe. If we don't have clean utensils or clean surface to work with, then our food is going to be potentially contaminated. And by surfaces, I mean anything that could potentially come in contact with food. That includes all of our utensils, our cooking pans, our cooking, anything that we're needing to cook with. And that also includes our hands and our surfaces, our countertops, our cutting boards, anything like that that we're working with. Before we start cooking, we want to make sure everything is clean and sanitized if we possibly can. There is a difference between cleaning and sanitizing. Cleaning is the process of getting dirt and debris off of a surface. Sanitizing is that extra step to actually kill or reduce the amount of pathogens that are on a surface. So when we're cleaning, we're getting all that dirt off and that debris off. But we want to make sure somewhat regularly that we also need to be sanitizing. There are solutions for making sanitizers at home. You can buy sanitizing solutions. You can make an easy bleach solution for sanitizing as well. Be aware of how you're using sanitizers because they can potentially cause a chemical contaminant on your food. So we want to make sure that we're using them safely and using them correctly. So we want to make sure our hands are washed. And I have a hand washing video that you can watch as well. But the really important key with that is that we wash our hands with soap and water. And when we're working in a kitchen, some people prefer using antibacterial soap, and that's okay if that's what you want to use to add an extra protection. But soap and water is enough to get off of your hands whatever might be potentially contaminating. And when you are cooking and preparing food, especially raw meats, you want to wash your hands much more regularly. After you've had contact with that food, you want to come wash your hands before you move on to a different task. That will help to reduce potential cross-contamination. Bacteria, unfortunately, and even viruses, we can't see them or smell them, so they may be passed on into our food without us knowing and cause potential for sickness. In addition to having clean hands, clean utensils, clean countertops, we also want to have clean food. So much of the food that we prepare, especially that food that comes to us fresh, needs to be washed before it's ready to be cooked. So we talked about thawing those frozen foods safely. One thing we do not want to wash before we cook it is things like poultry. I know there's a tradition of rinsing the poultry out. It's really not safe. What can happen if we do that is if we have poultry in our sink and we're rinsing it out, the bits of poultry juice might get out onto the sink, up on the walls, on our countertops. We may not necessarily see it, but it's contaminating all of those surfaces potentially. So it's not very safe to wash that chicken, and it's not necessary either. You might have some bits you need to pull off, especially if you're cooking a big turkey. There might be some bits and things to pull off of it, but you don't need to rinse it out. You do want to rinse fresh produce. And you'll look at the packaging on it. Some produce, if it's already bagged, might say washed and ready to eat. That does not need extra rinsing or washing to it. It's already been washed and processed through. But things like any whole fruit, even especially that has a rough surface to it, take a scrub brush, really get it good and wet. And you don't need special cleaners or any kind of special sanitizers or anything for your produce. Running water is enough to get the debris and the dirt off of it, which is the goal for when we're washing our produce. Let's talk now about cooking, because cooking is really important to make sure we are keeping our food safe. If we're not cooking it to the right temperature, then we're potentially causing a nice breeding ground for our food, for that bacteria to grow, and it's not going to keep our food safe for us, regardless of all the other steps we might have taken to keep it safe. So regardless of if we use a stovetop, if we use our oven, even if we use our microwave, you have to check the temperature of your food. And so different foods that have different risks for some of the different foodborne illnesses need to be cooked at different temperatures. So I'm going to share with you a chart that you can look at to see some of the minimum internal temperatures for food that you can only check by using a food thermometer.
You can't tell whether a food is cooked just by looking at it.
After we've cooked our food, we also need to be thinking about how we are presenting it, because once it leaves the heat or comes out of refrigeration, that timeline starts for that time and temperature control. So if food is left out for too long, that bacteria can start growing again. So it's really important that we are making sure that we are timing things properly so that we have food sitting out either hot or cold without temperature control for amount. Cooling food is really important too. Our goal with that is to get food out through that temperature danger zone, which is the temperature zone that bacteria grows most rapidly. We want to get it through there and into refrigeration as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. And also without ruining the integrity of the food. So if you have a big amount of soup, a large casserole, like something like that, it's best to put it in smaller containers as quickly as possible. And those containers can then go into a refrigerator. We don't want to put a large pot of soup or a really large container of food into a refrigerator because it's not going to get cool enough in the middle quickly enough for that to be safe. We definitely don't want to leave hot food sitting on a counter or sitting without any kind of heat or cooling for too long, because then that bacteria is going to start to grow. And even if the outside of it seems like it might be cooling, that inside of it could be growing bacteria. So we want to make sure we're putting it in smaller containers or in really shallow containers and get it in that refrigerator as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope that I shared with you some tips to keeping your kitchen and your food safe this holiday season. Be sure to check out all the extra resources that I have available for you there. You can also go to the Purdue Extension website at any time. Be sure to like us on Facebook, Purdue Extension Vanderburgh County, and check out other videos that we've made with other healthy tips and tricks for you this holiday season.